Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Whatever time it is, I hope that you're having a good time and I hope that you're learning from these lectures. This is the fifth lecture, and the fourth one that students are required to watch as homework. This is the second lecture that will be dealing with questions that are related to deductive arguments. So let's go ahead and get started. So last time I began by explaining that some of the vocabulary that we use for critical thinking has special meanings. Some of the words, of course, have their usual meaning. So words like contradiction, which means two things that are opposites being true at the same time. Words like excluded, which means to be taken out of. Words like disjunction or disjunctive, which, as I explained last time, is just a big word for or for our purposes. Words like conjunction, which means two things being together, or the word and. Words like hypothetical, which means that something is not necessarily actually the case, but is merely something we are considering to be the case. Words like syllogism, which is an old word for argument from Aristotle, and words like probable, which refer to things that are most likely true. I also discussed certain other words like deductive, which has a special meaning for us, the words strong and weak, which we'll look at in a little bit, the words valid and invalid, which we'll look at today, the word sound, which we'll also look at today. Later in the semester, we'll look at inductive, and we always want to keep in mind the meaning of statement and the meaning of dilemma. So just to refresh your memory, I am going to summarize again the things that we covered in the first few lectures. Now, in the first lectures, we covered some general rules for argumentation. We covered such ideas as first finding the premises and conclusions, engaging in a natural argument order, something that will be easy for your listener or reader to understand. And also we looked at what makes something a good argument, which we defined as an argument that is able to convince a listener. We also emphasized several important points when you're making your argument. We emphasized that the main goal is to be clear, and that you can do this by being concrete, concise, and consistent. And that when you make an argument, your focus should be on the argumentation, not on emotional or loaded language. So I'm going to repeat something else that's very important. So I want to repeat the definition of a statement. Now, a statement is a claim that can be either true or false. So then, statements are things that are often stated using what we call a declarative sentence. So if I said, it is cloudy, this would be a declarative sentence and this would be a statement. If I said, how old are you? This would not be a statement. The first hint is that it is worded as a question, but that's not all. The other hint that's more important is you can ask yourself, what would it mean for this sentence to be true? And if the answer is unclear, it's probably not a statement. Okay, let's move on. The next important thing I wanted to talk to you about is Aristotle's 3 laws. Now, we talked about them last time in detail, so I won't spend as long in them this time. But Aristotle's 3 laws are the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. So the law of identity is A equals A. So if we said Aristotle is Aristotle, then we are following this law. If I said Aristotle is Plato, then we are not following that law. Second law, law of non-contradiction. We can word it this way, not A and not A. Now, what I mean by that is that A and its opposite cannot be true at the same time. So if I said that Aristotle is a man and Aristotle is a phoenix, Aristotle cannot be both a man and a phoenix at the same time. That would contradict this law. Or, to put it another way, anytime that we are talking about anything, we can't have both that and its opposite be true at the same time. Again, third law. Law of the excluded middle, A or not A. For any claim, we have to decide whether it's true or not. This is probably the hardest law, but also the most important one for doing logic. So for instance, if I return to it is cloudy, I have to decide if this is true or false. In the system of logic for deductive arguments, we can't fit in difficult things like it is partially cloudy and partially sunny. We have to pick one or the other. Now, this is a disadvantage, but it's a disadvantage that we want because it lets us do something really important. Okay, on to the next slide. So last time we looked at 5 argument patterns. So I'm going to briefly repeat those argument patterns and remind you of their names. So modus ponens, if P then Q, P therefore Q. This is the pattern for modus ponens. Modus tollens, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. So I want you to write these 2 patterns down because we're going to use them a little bit later today and we're going to see something where things can go wrong that will look very similar to these patterns. Alright, disjunctive syllogism. So again, disjunctive is a word that means or. So or is the key to understanding this pattern, A or B, not A, therefore B. Hypothetical syllogism, if P then Q, if Q then R, therefore if P then R. Again, the word hypothetical roughly means if that were to be the case. So that's the basic pattern here. This looks familiar. This pattern looks similar to a pattern that we've already learned. This looks somewhat like a modus ponens. Let me explain why it's not. So here we have if Dr. K is teaching the class. Let's call that P. Then the class is in English. Let's call that Q. Dr. K is not teaching the class. This is going to be not P. Therefore the class is not in English, not Q. So let's take this and let's write it again over here just to make it easier. So what do we have? P implies Q, not P, not Q. Alright. This pattern is not modus ponens. This pattern is not modus tollens. So let's repeat what those are. Modus ponens, if P then Q, P therefore Q. So the first premise is the same, second premise is different. Modus tollens, if P then Q, not Q, therefore not P. But this premise isn't not Q, this premise is not P. So this pattern is broken. This pattern is nothing. Do not use this pattern. Okay, so let me give you an example of the same pattern. The name of this pattern is denying the antecedent. So let me show you that this pattern is the same. If Japan wins the World Cup, this means they are strong. Japan will not win the World Cup, therefore Japan is not strong. So, we'll call this P. We'll call this Q. We'll call this P, not P. And we'll call this not Q. So again, if P then Q, not P, therefore not Q. So this is not the same as modus ponens, this is not the same as modus tollens. This argument pattern is broken. So let's think about this for a second. Even if Japan does not win the World Cup, they could still be strong. So let's say that Germany came in second. That would not mean Germany is weak, that would mean Germany is strong. So if Japan wins the World Cup, that would mean they're strong. This is true. But there are other ways of being strong than winning the World Cup. There's another thing that we need to be careful about that I want to mention here, which is that the way we use words in English is sometimes looser than the way that we need to use words to make deductive arguments. Let me explain. Be careful. Words like if, then, and or are used in ways in logic that do not mean exactly the same things as they do in normal usage. So for instance, this hard to understand sentence, only if Shane is attending will John also attend. This only if changes the meaning versus if. So we need to change the order. Only if Shane is attending will John also attend. This means if John attends, then Shane is attending. Another one. If I say you can pick between apples and pears, but you can't bring both, then I'm saying this means or. So let's move on. Please consider the following argument. If Dr. K is teaching the class, then the class is in English. The class is in English, therefore Dr. K is teaching the class. So let's look at the form here. So, let's call that P. Let's call that Q. So again, we have our basic pattern of P implies Q. Then we have here, the class is in English. This is Q. And we have as our conclusion P. But we need to think a little bit more about this. So again, modus ponens, if P then Q, P therefore Q. Modus tollens, if P therefore Q, not Q, therefore not P. So what is wrong with this pattern? The answer is, in this pattern, the second claim is Q, not P. What that means is this again is a broken pattern. This is not the correct way to make this argument. What else can we say from this? We can say that this is similar to modus ponens and modus tollens. Well, we've already seen that the form is like this. If K, then E, E therefore K. The name of this pattern is affirming the consequent. So last week we learned that the antecedent is the left part and the consequent is the right part. In this case, we are affirming the consequent. This is a fallacy. Do not use this pattern. It does not work. Let's practice it a little bit more. If America wins its game, then America will make it out of the group stage. America made it out of the group stage, therefore America won its game. So again, here we have our P, here we have our Q. Here we have our Q, and there we have a P. So again, P implies Q, Q, therefore P. Again, if you see this pattern, it does not work. America actually made it out of the group stage by having a draw and having another team lose. So in reality, America did not win its game, but still advanced out of the group stage. The way America did this was that America had a draw and another team had a loss. So again, we didn't say anything about that. All we said was if America wins, then it will make it out of the group stage. We didn't say there's no other way, and there wasn't no other way. The last thing I want to talk to you about today is a very important concept that students have a lot of trouble with. So not only non-native speakers, but also native speakers have a lot of trouble handling this concept. So what I want to talk to you about is validity in deductive arguments. Normally, we want to know if our conclusion is true. But we can also ask whether or not our argument is valid. So this is the first hint. We talk about arguments as valid or invalid, claims as true or false. So let me repeat that. We talk about arguments as valid or invalid and statements as true or false. So premises are true or false. Conclusions are true or false. Arguments are valid or invalid, deductive or inductive. Now, what does valid mean? Valid means an argument follows all of the rules. So, to give an example of something that's not an argument, I would say a valid driver's license is one that you can use in the country you live in because you followed all the rules. So arguments can be valid or invalid if they follow the rules or don't follow the rules. So all of the patterns that I've told you, modus ponens, modus tollens, disjunctive syllogism, hypothetical syllogism, and dilemma, all of these are patterns that make an argument valid. On the other hand, affirming the consequent or denying the antecedent are patterns that are invalid. Now, we'll see why next week, but for now, just memorize them as valid or invalid. Again, true is the claim that something is actually the case. And this applies to claims, not to arguments. So, there's no chain between being valid and being true. The argument being valid does not mean any statement in an argument is true. So I can make valid arguments with all false claims. Let me repeat that. An argument can be valid if every single claim is false. The conclusion being true does not make an argument valid. So again, just because the conclusion is true doesn't mean the argument is valid. To return to a soccer example, one of the most famous goals in soccer is Pele scoring using his hand. Now, according to the rules of soccer, that is invalid. You're not allowed to do that. But it's still counted as a goal, which is similar to the concept of truth. Finally, an argument that is valid is what we call truth-preserving. So what that means is it keeps the truth of its premises. So if all the premises are true and the argument is valid, then the conclusion must be true. Truth-preserving does not mean the argument's conclusion is true. Instead, truth-preserving means that if the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. I'll repeat that. If the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true. So let's work through some questions. I'm going to ask you if these are true or false. True or false? An argument with all true premises must have a true conclusion. This is false. Alright? True or false? An argument with all true premises can have a true conclusion. This is true. True or false? An argument that is valid must have a true conclusion. This is false. Merely because you followed all of the rules doesn't mean that you won the game, doesn't mean that you scored the goal, doesn't mean that you're right. Alright? So we can ask ourselves another question. When will it have a true conclusion? What about this? When all the premises are true and the argument is valid, will it have a true conclusion? Here the answer is yes. Because being valid means if all the premises are true, the conclusion must also be true. At all times, here the answer is no. It's possible the argument is valid, but it has false premises. Then it doesn't matter for the truth of the conclusion. What about when at least one premise is true? Here the answer is false. Only if all the premises are true is a truth-preserving, valid deductive argument going to have a true conclusion. Finally, true or false? An argument that is valid and has true premises must have a true conclusion. Here the answer is true. In this case, it will have a true conclusion because it's valid and it has truth-preserving deductive form, and we have a name for this, which is that we call it sound. So let's move to the next slide. The deductive argument can be valid and have a false conclusion. Again, being valid just means it follows all of the rules. Having a true conclusion is not always connected to following all the rules. So a deductive argument can be invalid and have a true conclusion. This would mean that the conclusion is true by coincidence. So our argument didn't prove it, but it also happened to be true. So for instance, if I say, if the sky is red, then it is in the afternoon. Therefore, it is in the afternoon. Turns out the sky is not red. But it also turns out that I'm recording this video in the afternoon. But what I said as a conclusion has no connection to the argument that I just made. In which case, the form is invalid, but the conclusion is true. Finally, a deductive argument cannot be valid, have true premises, and a false conclusion. Because if it's valid, then if it has true premises, then it must have a true conclusion. Again, if it is valid, then if it has true premises, it must have a true conclusion. So if an argument is valid and has a false conclusion, we can say at least one premise is false, and that's what's making the argument have a false conclusion. So finally, we want to talk about the concept of soundness. An argument that is deductively valid and has all true premises is an argument that we call sound. This means every sound argument is a deductive argument. Every sound argument has all true premises, and if an argument has one false premise, it cannot be sound. If an argument is not valid, it is not sound. So in order for it to be sound, it has to be a valid deductive argument, and it has to have all true premises. Okay, so I want to end by suggesting what you can do based on today's lesson. The first thing we did was we learned to avoid three problems. Avoid affirming the consequent. So avoid argument patterns that go like this. If A, then B, B, therefore A. Avoid denying the antecedent. This pattern looks like this. If A, then B, not A, therefore not B. Avoid getting confused by the English, so please try to think about what a sentence means, and don't pay too much attention to exactly how it is worded to try to understand that. Next thing, we want to understand the concept of valid. Valid means rule following, particularly that it follows the rules of deductive arguments. We'll look at these next week, but they're basically rules about how to understand the words and, or, if, then, and not. Again, understand that true means something is the case. That sound means a valid argument with true premises. Now this is important. Valid is not sound. So this is important. Valid is not the same as true. True is about claims. Valid is about arguments. Again, valid is also not the same as sound. Sound means valid and all true premises. So I hope that you enjoyed this particular lecture. I hope that you're learning. If you're in the class, there will be a quiz on the material. If you have any questions, comments, or suggestions, please feel free to ask in class or to leave a comment on the YouTube video. I look forward to hearing from you.